Oh hey, I'm glad you're here. As a child, we'd often play games of pretend. We pretend to be cats or dogs, babies, that's a popular one with my daughter. Then we expand upon that. We get more fantastical with our imagination. We become cyclops and unicorns and winged banshee creatures and monsters of all sorts. As a child growing up in a video store, I would pretend to be Dar from Beastmaster, or Atreyu from The Neverending Story, or even like a male version of Sarah in Labyrinth. I mean, who wouldn't want to be friends with Hoggle? Then as we get older, though, we stop playing those games. But we really don't stop pretending, do we? We just then have to pretend we care what people think about our lives, or how we dress, or at work what Carol thinks about what we did over the weekend, and Carol has to pretend to care what we did over the weekend, when really Carol just wants us to shut up so she can talk about what she did over the weekend. And we know, it's the same knitting circle. Blah, 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 Carol. But that version of pretending, it lacks a very important thing, and a topic that comes up at the end of this recording, something that's near and dear to my heart, and that's one word: imagination. This guest today touches on a lot of very important things, things that I'm very passionate about. It's a lot of things I didn't expect from this film and from this guest, and I'm so thankful to have the opportunity to sit down with her and for her to share her story as well as talk about this film. So without further ado, the film is The Lure, the guest is Una the Mermaid, and this is VH Us. Hello, and welcome to VHS. I'm your host, Dirk Marshall, and I'm joined in the studio by Una the Mermaid, who is a mermaid. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
People will need to find more out about you on your website, UnaTheMermaid. That's UnaTheMermaid.com.
Yes.
And on social media, Una_the_mermaid on Instagram.
Yes.
And on Facebook, Una the Mermaid.
Yes.
Great. And it's necessary for anyone that doesn't know Una the Mermaid to go to those places because it's a very visual, fascinating thing that you do, and people need to see that.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. You're also, in addition to being Una the Mermaid, you're the owner and producer of the Traveling Fantasy Cove.
Yes.
Fantasy
yes.
Cove,
Mm-hmm.
the Portland Mermaid Parade, and Siren's Balk. Would you mind just breaking down a little bit about those three individual things?
Sure. The Traveling Fantasy Cove is a community venture. I started, right around 2011, 2012, where I started professionally mermaiding and discovered that there was a community of others who wanted to do the same. And for those that are unfamiliar with what professional mermaiding is, it's actually, don't overthink it. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's being a mermaid professionally and entertaining individuals. And I do it more on a community level. So it's an open invitation to people who want to do what I call the magical work of being a mermaid. It's body positive, and there's a lot of benefits and teaching opportunities. And so I encourage people to come because it actually creates a magical environment where people get to explore their own hidden magic within, and it creates a safe place where they can do that. And also it creates interesting and magical opportunities to work with the public and children and families. And we also use it not just as an entertainment sort of venture,
Sure, yeah.
But we do it as a way to help spread positive messages of not only body positivity, but also environmental messages as well for stewardship of the waters and oceans as well.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And you recently have a new tank.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
It looks amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm excited to come see it in person. Things have been a little hectic and busy, and you've had a number of events that you've done, but I want to bring my daughter. She loves mermaids, and so I'm excited to come see it in person.
Yeah, the tank was a many-year dream sort of in motion.
Yeah.
And and trying to come up with the practicality of it to travel with your own tank. There's a lot of pros and cons with such a venture. And because the Northwest is also a unique environment, this isn't Vegas, this isn't Florida, California. We have a lot of challenges we face, whether it's weather and also air temperature, which makes it difficult to actually mermaid in this geographic area. So having to really come up with some creative ways to make this dream possible in this region, which we have successfully done.
I've never even thought about the temperature aspect.
Yes.
But that is something you would have to think about for sure.
Yes. And, and different mermaids will, not that many mermaids have tanks. There's a handful, I would say, that have their own tanks, and the rest swim in professional tanks that maybe are at aquariums or places in Vegas or dive bar, rec bar, things like that. But yeah, air temperature and water temperature are a really big deal. In warmer climates, it's not as big of a deal. And so people can get away with not necessarily heating their water. It's a really big deal in the Northwest when the air temperature is on average. Even the summer, we had a cooler summer than normal. So getting that water temp up is a challenge. But
so the Traveling Fantasy Cove is what you've touched on, correct?
Yes.
What is the Mermaid Parade, the Portland Mermaid Parade?
Portlandia Mermaid Parade.
Oh, Portlandia Mermaid Parade, sorry, yes.
So the Portlandia Mermaid Parade started off as kind of a for us, by us event. So there is a local mermaid community in the Portland metro area.
Okay.
Kind of a subculture that probably many people didn't actually know about.
I didn't before Sarah told me that you were this person, and then I looked at all the things you were doing, and I was like, why doesn't everybody know about Una the Mermaid?
I think archetypally speaking, mermaids are sort of emotional creatures, and a lot of mermaids don't do it for public entertainment purposes, and quite frankly, that's not how I started. I did it honestly it was more inner community, and a lot of the events we did, although they were public, they were definitely geared towards more we were working in events that were within subcultures already.
Okay.
We didn't really hit the mainstream, if that makes sense.
Fairy World or something different?
Fairy Worlds is a fantasy festival, music festival that happens here in the Northwest. But we did a lot of other pirate festivals and sort of local subculture events.
Sure.
And so within that community, we were known, But as far as mainstream, I think the Portlandia Mermaid Parade was the first time that the mermaid scene, if you will, in Portland was kind of made public. It was kind of our coming out.
That's awesome.
Event, and it was just really well received. I think, we started with the local community. I honestly didn't expect to have as many people interested as we did in the beginning.
Yeah.
I think on our very first parade that we did it'll be 5 years ago. This coming year, we hit about 500 people showed up for the first time.
Wow.
Which was a huge surprise, a pleasant surprise.
Yeah.
And also just a lot of individuals coming out that said, I identify as a mermaid. I had no idea there were other people like me.
Yeah.
And created an opportunity for people to connect and network and pursue this field of mermaiding, whether it's professionally or just for fun as a hobby.
Yeah. And then what is the Sirens Ball?
The Sirens Ball is basically just a party. It's a celebration for all things mermaid. The Portlandia Mermaid Parade up to this point hasn't really been a festival per se. It's a parade. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what it is. And so
floats.
Handmade floats, push carts, things like that. Okay. Wagons, usually mermaids are in wagons.
That makes sense. Sure.
Like mobile chairs and things like that. And the ball is sort of a swanky mermaid fancy ball. It's an opportunity for people to get dressed up. And Portland is sort of known for quirky events and also subcultural events. I mean, we have the vampire ball, there's the swashbucklers ball, there's at one time we had the goblin ball. There's just lots of I
don't know what the goblin ball is, but I want to go.
Yeah, and there's the witches ball. There's a bunch of events like that, but mermaids haven't really been represented. So, and the Sirens Ball was also to kind of acknowledge the darker waters, if you speak. So I wouldn't go as far as saying gothic because it's not quite the realm that we're in. But but siren, we do in my community distinguish a difference between sirens and mermaids, and sirens are more I don't know, sultry, and a little bit edgier. And so the Sirens Ball is designed to be kind of representing that element.
Nice.
Of mermaiding.
So you've kind of created avenues for the different aspects of mermaiding.
Yes.
So you don't have to mix. You don't want a sultry parade for children, I guess would
Exactly.
be, yeah. So it's
Exactly.
nice that you can find a healthy way to have all those different
Yeah,
avenues.
exactly.
The reason that I'm joined by Una the Mermaid is because we're brought together by the film The Lure. At the time of this recording, the film can be found on Criterion, rented at Movie Madness, and I'm sure streamed in different places. The synopsis is: in Warsaw, a pair of mermaid sisters are adopted into a cabaret. While one seeks love with humans, the other hungers to dine on the human population of the city. This was not a first-time view for you.
No.
I, for some reason, thought people hadn't seen it, but being an expert in the field, you have seen probably most mermaid material, for good or bad.
Yes.
And some of it's pretty rough.
Yes.
Especially in like the horror quadrant and things like that. Mm-hmm. I chose this for a specific reason, though, because you are Una the Mermaid and you do events, but you also have a special tank that you tour with, which is very interesting, and you also work in, I think, a very serious subject matter with mermaiding.
Well, as far as mermaiding is concerned, there's always an element of what we might call artistic activism involved. But professionally speaking, when I'm not mermaiding, I am a full-time educator and I work in the field of restorative justice.
Yes.
And I work with the incarcerated populations here in the state of Oregon. Yeah.
So when you say restorative justice, what is that for anyone outside of the field?
Sure. So to kind of put it in a more simple way, traditionally our justice system has been based on what we would call a retributive paradigm. Justice is about sort of identifying what laws have been broken and what punishments are deserved based on the breaking of the laws.
Got it.
And from the restorative justice perspective, the harm in that is that we're actually removing the human element out of the justice piece, which is human relationships, and actually looking at what do victims and communities and even offenders need to heal from trauma or harm, and how do we really prevent it in the long term. And so out of the field of sort of child psychology, actually, there's a discipline or a field also known as positive discipline, which is the idea, basically the difference between discipline and punishment and how it affects the psyche and the consciousness, and looking at ways to actually promote healthy behavior change and transformation. And basically there's a lot of scientific research showing that because punishment is often based on deterrence through fear, that fear creates sort of primal instincts in the brain, and it actually causes higher thinking processes in the brain to shut down. And so the pieces of transformation and sort of cognitive reasoning and critical thinking, those parts of the brain actually shut down when we're operating from a place of fear.
Wow.
And so if we're going to really look at the justice system, we should be reevaluating, how are we impacting people, not only on a human level, but actually even biologically, like through a brain-based approach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. That's very different than what I was thinking it was, but maybe it's not. So when I was talking to Sarah, she used to do social work, and she worked with children who had been sexually offended. A lot of them then re-offended, the learned cycle. And then they would do sort of a restorative justice where they were reconnecting the offender with the offendee.
Yes.
So there was advocates on both sides to make sure that the person that had been offended was, not being put through the paces or through some situation that wasn't healthy for them in some way. But that's different than what you do.
Well, it's all part of the same paradigm. So what you're referring to in the field of restorative justice is known as restorative circle process or a restorative direct encounter, where victims and offenders come face to face to meet. But that is one small piece of the much larger picture. And part of, actually, I'm completing my doctorate right now, and I'm doing my dissertation on restorative justice. And part of the research that I'm doing is actually talking about how direct encounters by themselves cannot, nor should they be, the entire definition of restorative justice. That restoration has to have a multi-pronged approach. And in some cases with crime, having a direct encounter is not appropriate or necessarily even feasible.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Right. And
Yeah.
so, okay, well, if we don't have a direct encounter, can we have restoration?
Right.
And in the early years of restorative justice, that was the argument people made to sort of discredit the paradigm.
Sure.
Since we can't do it consistently and maybe we can't do it at all, then really what good is this approach? Right. And so it's really about building a wider conversation about what restoration really means. And direct encounters are an integral piece of transformation because often people's worldviews are created and fabricated through the imagination. And it is not until we breach the walls of the imagination by actually having a direct encounter with somebody that might challenge our worldview or our perception, sometimes that is what's needed to actually create the transformation for both victim and offender and community.
Yeah.
Right? Victims come in, they have a perception of what the offender is, right? It's often this monster, this sort of dehumanized image, an object, when and offenders often dehumanize their victims, right? They're not real people. And
absolutely.
so when we bring them into a space where it's guided, of course, and it's facilitated dialogue, there are opportunities for humanization to happen. And that's where that restorative piece comes in, because it's this idea that regardless if someone has to ultimately, be incarcerated or be separated from the community, most people actually get released from prison and they come back into the community.
Right.
Right. So restorative justice is asking this question, well, okay, well, what are we doing about that? And what do those human relationships look like when we come back into community?
Yeah.
And what does community even mean for different people?
Sure.
And what are they reintegrating into? And so those direct encounters are sort of an integral piece and sort of creating more security, right, for the aftermath of harm, after punishment, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow, that is amazing. I'm so glad you're here, and thank you for sharing that. The film, that's what we were talking about.
Yes.
The director is Agnieszka Smoczynska. I think I'm saying that right, but I could be really murdering it. She's mostly known for doing shorts and some TV in Poland. The cinematographer is Jacob Kajowski. Same thing, mostly television in Poland. The editor is Jaroslaw Kaminski. He did shorts and films that I can't find here in the States. So unfortunately, all of their work is somehow trapped in Poland, except for The Lure. This continues on through the actors, who I think are all fantastic, but it's really going to be up to any of the listeners to track them down. The film starts off with a beautiful illustrated credit sequence, and we see from the mermaid's point of view that there's two men on the beach playing music, and the director says that our mermaid comes from the water and wants to enter the world of humans, so she has to become a woman in her own right and go through a rite of initiation, and those rites entail pain and the loss of your world and your previous identity. How do you feel about that as a mermaid?
It's a powerful narrative, and I think it's one that it reigns true for not only me personally in my own personal life, but I think especially for people who identify in the mermaid archetype, because mermaids are typically seen as we're sort of spirits walking this earth that don't necessarily feel like we fit in with mainstream thinking. I think there's a tendency to be highly focused on emotions and wanting deeper connection than what the world at its current place in history is able to offer. And sometimes we are alone swimming in our waters, and sometimes we find other mermaids and we join together in that sense. And I think this longing for the human world is really a symbolization of longing for connection, but longing for connection to a world that doesn't really fit with who we are. And it's this sort of this age-old tale of like having to change who you are in some way. You have to give up something in order to get something, right? And this narrative that continues throughout these legends and these myths and these stories. And so, what are we willing to sacrifice in order to get love or connection or acceptance or adventure or whatever it is, right? But whatever the dream is, it's the fundamental principle is this idea that it doesn't come for free. And there can be great suffering, and you may not even get it after all is said and done.
That's true. That is something that we will get to. She describes it as a riff on Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid, in which a mermaid marries a human who loves her so she can gain an immortal soul.
Yeah.
But she didn't want to create a mermaid inferior to mankind, which is why her mermaid doesn't want an immortal soul. She comes into the world and falls in love with a human, and out of love sacrifices a part of herself. She says it could happen to anyone. In this case, it's 2 young girls.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty interesting. It's part of anytime there's a female director telling a story like about young girls or growing, the loss of innocence or anything. I think it's important stories to be told and for people to watch, because there's more than enough on the other side of the coin of men telling that narrative.
Right.
And it's often very off.
Yeah.
From what I learned from friends who are women.
Right.
Also, Homer is another reference for the film, where fishermen are lured by sirens who eat men and live off of human flesh. I don't know a lot about sirens, but is that's where most of the siren comes from, is Homer, or is there a huge siren history?
It's interesting because actually from the mythological perspective, a mermaid and a siren are not even of the same genre.
Okay.
A siren is more, how do I describe it? Like a water banshee. I don't know how to describe it, but it's more of an apparition. It doesn't even live in the water. Sirens are typically entities that will often, but not always, take on the form of a woman.
Okay.
But they will take on whatever form is necessary to lure their prey. But because they're often seen as entities that linger around or exist near water, whether it's the ocean, lakes, ponds, rivers, creeks, whatnot, they often will appear in those spaces, and they will often sing a beautiful song. Right. They have very mermaid-like qualities. They're often not seen with legs, which is, I think, where sometimes that correlation happens, that confusion happens, because they're like an apparition. But they're kind of like the apparition that they follow the apparition like a mirage, and they see it, and sailors follow the voice. They're hypnotized only to drown, and they go into the water and they never return because they're following this image.
Okay.
Yes, but I think pop culture over time has started to equate siren and mermaid together. And I also think that even in our own culture, we've distinguished sirens as being almost creature, more monster-like, and mermaids have taken on the Disney quality of Princess Ariel.
Right.
Right. And so that's kind of, I think, right now how we sort of visualize these two beings.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because I'll just offer real quick sort of a feminist perspective, which of course is that, historically, mermaids and sirens were not depicted as particularly beautiful necessarily.
Okay.
Maybe they were, but they were very powerful beings. And I think it's always interesting when a female archetype emerges. She's, sort of relegated to a monster, which is actually a narrative that plays out over and over again in mythologies, even in tales of goddesses and gods of Roman and Greek mythology. At one time, the divine feminine was revered, and then later those same archetypes were later converted into devils and demons and succubi and these things. And so it's kind of an interesting pattern to sort of watch unfold throughout human history as we sort of how the female archetype is depicted through mythologies.
Yeah, it's for worse, it seems like.
I think we're getting, I think it's starting to change.
Better?
I think there's some more increasing awareness that's starting to happen.
Cool.
But I also think that those who identify as more female, I'm going to leave that really open.
Sure.
We aren't given a lot of choices
to
sort of reveal who we are. We're complex beings and complex characters, just like men are.
Yeah.
And so I don't think it's wrong to depict more female-aligned characters as having a darker, more mysterious side. I think the difference is, though, who gets to control that narrative and through which lens is it being portrayed.
Exactly, which is why I wanted to talk about this movie and this director and what she had to say. She also goes on to say that her mermaids are not the sweet young girls from Disney movies. They're half monsters and half beautiful creatures. She wanted to create a new archetype of mermaid, in her words. I don't know if she's well-versed in the mermaid world, which is why their tails are more dragon-like than less beautiful, which is how my daughter would want a mermaid tail to be a rainbow, basically. And these are cod or a dragon of some sort. It's it's really impressively kind of grotesque in a way. One thing they focused on also that I thought was interesting is how a mermaid would move, because in the water they have this 10-foot long tail. I think in the movie they're 9.5 feet, and on land their bodies would be, there's less of a body. So how would you even, let alone walking part, but just there's just less of you.
Yes.
So it's kind of a fascinating thing to even think about in a murderous musical mermaid movie.
Right.
That all of this thought went into these characters. I don't know. It's
Well, it's interesting too because, well, one, because I am a mermaid and I wear
Yes.
tails, and one of my heaviest tails out of water is about 45, 50 pounds. And I can relate to the idea of grace is lost when you're a mermaid above water.
Yeah.
You're very vulnerable and you're very heavy and you cannot move or navigate and you're out of your element, literally speaking.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because I also think, metaphorically speaking, when we talk about women's power and we think about, okay, when we think about mermaids, whether they're monsters or some Disney princess,
Sure.
but the premise is they're most powerful and they're most equipped when they're in their element in water, right? And women, I think, generally speaking, have limited realms in which we can actually be powerful.
Right.
And so in one respect, one of the reasons why the mermaid archetype sort of reigns true is that for many of us that are often just by nature find ourselves vulnerable constantly in a world where women are yet to receive full equity.
Yeah.
We are limited to certain spaces where our power can be revealed, and we can be very powerful when we're in our element, but out of that element, we're far more vulnerable and maybe not as able to navigate our strength the way we would prefer.
But yeah, in this movie, the two actresses playing the mermaids actually wore the tails that were super heavy. It's not CG effects. There's one transformation scene where they use some computer graphics to make it go skin to tail, but the rest of the time they're actually wearing them. They had to train to move in them, which is why I wanted to talk about this film, because I feel like for all intents and purposes they tried to do the best job of telling a mermaid's tale with the proper training and everything, which I think it's impressive. There was no corners cut, and they spent 3 years, I think, working on creating this movie and training people, and it was pretty intense. The mermaids sing a song and call the men into the sea, and then suddenly we get a straight cut to a woman screaming. And then we're in the nightclub, and this is instantly where I fell in love with this movie. The sound design and the cinematography are amazing. And we don't get a lot of Polish cinema here. There's been a couple films in the last 10 years that I've really enjoyed. But this story, based on a true story about two sisters who grew up in this nightclub, the only thing they added was the mermaid part. But I guess it's very common for parents to have these restaurant, nightclub places where there's shows going on, dinner being served, and they grew up in this very sort of sexualized environment, and that's part of what the loss of innocence story in this is technically about. It was shot in Aria, which is a legendary club in Warsaw, where the sisters grew up. We get a wonderful tour of the club and see the whole family who's running it. Quite a cast of characters. A man enters the room, and the girls are in there with the lady who introduces him to her, or them. And this is a scene that almost made me turn off the movie. It's the scene where they pour water on the girls. The drummer does. The tails pop out, and a man sort of probes them. I was very disturbed by it. In their human forms, they don't have genitalia, which he points out first. And it's this whole scenario that's symbolic of sort of how men test young girls. They're treated as an object, even though they're present. They're in the room. They're portrayed, minus genitals. There's no vagina. He says they're Barbie smooth. There's no butt. If this wasn't directed by a woman, I would not ever even have talked about this film again. Just based on this scene, I wouldn't have even finished the film because I'd be like, why is he doing this? What is he saying with it? But because it's coming from a lady, I think it's important. The layers that are there are worth discussion. But also, Sarah mentioned to me something, and I want to clarify this. Are there people who like to be a mermaid because from the waist down they don't have genitalia?
That's an interesting
Like they feel safe?
question. I have never thought of it in that regard consciously, but
Okay.
I think, well, this is a complicated question, so let me break it into a couple pieces.
Oh, yeah, please.
Okay, so
Sorry.
on a personal level, I've never thought of it that way directly, but now that you say it, inherently, there is a degree of safety that I am now realizing. Actually, this is a bit of an aha moment for me
Oh,
while
great.
you mention this,
Oh,
because
wonderful.
I think that in one way, it's the mermaid is sensual and sexual, but there's no sort of, as there's a sort of a quirky vintage song that talks about the mermaid, about, you know, what am I going to do with the bottom half of the mermaid, and
yeah.
and you can't really do anything, and that's the point. And you can appreciate the mermaid for what she is without having to explore that.
Yeah.
I have a community that identifies sexually and gender wise in a variety of complex ways.
Okay.
I would imagine each and every one of them might actually have their own personal take on this question.
Sure.
And to a certain extent, I think that might actually reign true for a few folks.
It made sense to me.
Yeah.
When she mentioned it, I was just like,
Sure.
oh, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah, and I think that, I know for me, in a way, I wouldn't say that it robs us of our sexuality, because I think for me, how I've always identified with the archetype is that the tail symbolizes this duality between worlds, and the tail represents my ability to navigate emotion in deep waters, and that's the spiritual piece of me. And then the mundane piece of me is the upper half, which is the part of me that's grounded in the human world, right? So even with people, like I tell people, mermaids don't actually breathe underwater. We're half human. I mean, we're mammals, actually. So we come up for air. So we're literally of both worlds. We're not all, if we breathed underwater, we would be fish.
Yeah.
But mermaids are not fish. They're hybrid creatures, right? And so that's how I've articulated it. So for me, it's not an absence of sexuality. I think in a way it's a reclaiming of sexuality, because like the scene in that film where they're trying to, the men in that scene, and even the woman that's part of that circle,
Yeah.
right? They're trying to basically figure out a way to exploit something.
Yes.
And for the mermaid, I think that it's a way to control how our bodies are seen or interpreted, if that makes sense.
Yes, of course.
But I don't know. I think that scene in the movie was actually really powerful. I almost shut it off myself,
Yeah.
because it was triggering for me, actually. Just as a survivor of my own life traumas, I wasn't sure what was going to happen.
Yes.
And I was just really on edge. I allowed it to continue. And then, you know, I think you have to take the movie in its entirety to fully understand the relevance of that scene.
Completely.
And without giving spoilers, you know, the movie...
we'll spoil things.
Okay.
It's okay.
There's definitely scenes of empowerment that occur in retaliation, actually, to that exact moment that comes later.
Yes.
But yeah, it's a powerful scene, but I also think it's very reflective. I think, you know, she's revealing to us a truth, a very painful truth that happens. And I think you can actually take it quite literally.
Yes.
In the scene, and also metaphorically in the sense of all sorts of ways, right? That childlike, you know, innocence, if you will, is taken and exploited for profit.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's like you said, like I'm glad I didn't turn it off. It's just I was having so much fun visually at that point, and then it gets to that scene and I was just like, oh, really? Like this is what we're going to have? Like
Right.
But, you know, I wanted to continue to see what she had to say with the film. The ladies are then taken to there's a beautiful performance that takes place right after that. Then the ladies are taken to a pool to rehydrate, and they seem like they're maybe recovering from trauma, and it's subtle, but I think if you've worked in social work or with people who've been through trauma, it's pretty kind of evident what we're seeing a tiny glimpse of. I love all the choreography in the film. We have a wonderful shopping scene that happens next that is like something out of a 60s musical or something. It's so beautiful and vibrant. And one thing that Sarah brought up is that in many of these types of films where young girls are being groomed or wowed, depending on the film, there's always a shopping scene. And it's like, this is your new life. Like, here's money to spend, you know, whether it's like Annie or Pretty Woman, or there's all these films where it's just like, well, that's the way to the lady's heart, is you got to show, like, now you can go shopping.
Aquamarine, which is a mermaid film. I don't know
Oh,
if you're
yeah.
familiar with the
No.
same thing. So the
Oh,
moment,
really?
yeah, she's a mermaid, she becomes human, she has to find love, and one of the pinnacle moments in the movie is when the two human girls take her
Oh,
shopping,
my gosh.
as a way of like, now you're one of us,
Oh,
right?
now
Like,
you're a gal.
yeah. But I think it's more than just being a gal. I think that sort of moving beyond gender, I think it's also a glimpse into a very specific Western cultural
Oh,
framework of consumerism.
you're right, yeah.
And I think that it's that identity of the human world is not just gender based, but it's like part of the human world. Is the world of objects, right? I mean, even Ariel, like, let's go back to Disney.
Oh, right.
With her cave of treasures.
Yeah.
Human treasures
Yes.
that she's sort of hoarding, actually, right?
Yes.
And collecting. And her whole fascination with the human world actually is cultivated through this collection of objects, right? And then the man becomes the final object to possess.
Right.
Right. And so, and that narrative is old and it plays out through numerous
Time
tales,
and time again.
time again, whether it's a mermaid film or otherwise, right? We see this consumer sort of this object narrative that just carries forward. So it's interesting.
Yeah. At least she's getting to shop for her own objects and not just having to get forks that fell through the
Right.
ships to the ocean. Then Silver gets a nosebleed and Hunk comes over to her rescue. Gold notices and they speak telepathically about the dangers of emotions with a human, which is interesting. I really like the telepathy aspect of this film and the subtle sort of like aquatic, almost dolphin noises that happen when they're like just looking at each other and having these conversations. It's pretty fascinating to see. Two sisters then perform their first number, and it's very catchy, and at the end they hop in a giant glass of water and sprout tails, which doesn't freak anybody out
Apparently.
at all in Poland. That's just normal.
Well, it was the 80s. I mean, I don't know.
Oh, that's true. Yes, that's a good point. No, we're not given an origin story for these mermaids. We don't know if they have family or where they come from exactly. But what was, and you initially just touched on this, but what was your introduction into mermaiding and when did it really become something that you were so passionate about?
Well, my husband and I had been involved in the festival community, and my husband was a pirate reenactor and part of the Renaissance sort of community, Ren Fair community, and whatnot. And I did that role, you know. And I've always, my family fostered in me lots of creative imagination. Costuming and dressing up were part of my life growing up.
Great.
Also, I think it was a coping mechanism for dealing with trauma. I mean, one of the best ways to escape a family of trauma was to go into another world, right?
Yeah.
And so as I got older, I just simply found a way to integrate that into adult life in a healthy and constructive way. And I discovered, you know, when you're younger, sometimes you're thrusted into roles not by choice. And even though I went along with a lot of these, you know, sort of the pirate archetype and played around with that, it was very misogynistic.
I was going to say, you'd have to
And-
be like a wench, in quotes.
You know,
I'm
well, no,
saying,
there were
or-
definitely like roles that women could play in there where they were captains or whatever, but they were never really accepted. And at one point, you know, sometimes female empowerment is often defined as being accepted into the male archetype and appropriating male archetype power, and therefore you are now liberated and equal with men.
Okay.
Instead of actually being accepted and held equally without changing who you are.
Yes.
And I came to that realization, strangely, in doing these sort of role plays and decided, I don't like this. This isn't me. This isn't who I am. How can I, you know, I happen to be a female who, you know, cisgendered female who does express herself in a feminine way. And I was tired of being forced to say, if you express yourself in a feminine way, you're automatically not powerful.
Yeah.
And, you know, the women in the pirate community often, you were a wench if you were sexual or sensual in any way, you were automatically a wench. If you wanted to be powerful, you had to strip yourself of all sexuality and basically look like a male.
A dude, yeah.
A dude. And I was like, there's got to be a way to be both powerful and sensual.
Mm-hmm.
And how it happened was I was at a fairy festival and I saw a mermaid for the first time, like in real life, like, you know,
Yeah.
as far as an entertainer. She
Sure.
was a young girl. It was part of a shtick of a business. You know, it was very simple, quaint, it was adorable. She was in like an old wooden hot tub. I think, she made her tail, and she didn't have a lot of makeup, she was just beautiful naturally, just the whole thing. And she had captured the imagination of probably 40, 50 people standing around this little hot tub.
Wow.
And she was very powerful. I mean, she was able to command the attention of 50
Yeah.
people, and yet she was completely vulnerable and she couldn't move. And like, it was this weird, I didn't consciously think of all of that in that moment. It was something that came to me, it would come to me over a period of time after that. But being that I'm from Hawaii and I spent a good majority of my younger years in the ocean,
Sure.
I've always identified as mermaid. And she opened up this realm of possibility. I didn't even occur to me that you could do costuming to this level and actually be in water, let alone swim. And then I was like, this is me. This is who I am. I am a mermaid. And like, if I'm going to go into this community in this genre, this is the best version of myself that I can be. And so mermaiding for me was not about a human putting on a mermaid costume. It was about me putting away my human costume and getting to be who I really am, for me. And I found empowerment in that. And I found a way to express myself and be valued for sort of, the embodiment of that archetype.
Yeah.
And then slowly evolving that archetype over time.
Sure.
Over the many years of doing this and still
Yeah.
trying to figure out, who am I within this archetype? And then being introduced into a whole world of other people who also identify in all sorts of interesting ways, and ultimately coming together and building a community, where similar narratives of basically, we're tired of being told what power is, and we would like to reclaim that for ourselves in however way that looks, and some people still find it through the warrior archetype, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
Men and women can be warriors, right? But the idea is we want to decide for ourselves what that looks like.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where we find that. And I think in the film, even though sort of the origin story of these mermaids, is not made clear.
Yeah.
I think for me, there is this sense of, they get sort of sucked into this adventure in the human world, but there is always this sense of these merfolk trying to define who they are and basically maintain a sense of control and to not lose their true self. I think that's part of the narrative that's playing out, right?
Yeah.
It's like not losing that, but it's risky, right? There's a
It
lot
is.
of temptations to lose oneself out there.
Yeah.
And it can happen sometimes it can happen in more subtle ways too. So
Yeah, it's very true. Then Silver kisses the hunk, and Gold really doesn't like that, and soon Gold sings a song in a flat that furthers the story about feeling alone. And I'm not a huge musical fan, but I feel like by having the performances in the Polish nightclub, it makes sense. And then the few songs that are outside of that further the story, as musicals tend to do, I'm willing to buy into. I'm guessing because of the cinematography and the aesthetic. I think that the cinematography uses 3 different setups for conveying different emotions throughout the film. And this the songs about sadness, I think because maybe I was a sad youth, really sits well for me, and that's sort of what she's expressing. And because there's a part of that when you're growing up, which is why I think I said earlier I'm so fascinated by the loss of innocence stuff, because you see the world a very magical place when you're a kid, and then as you grow up, it's like just things falling away and being shown to you like it's actually this terrible thing or whatever
Right.
it is, and it's I just think it's a lot of damage can be done to you at that time, and by looking at these stories, maybe you can still learn stuff about yourself from the past.
Sure.
Maybe. But yeah, this scene, I mean, it's a really great number. Then Gold goes hunting, and she sees a man and entrances him just with a look, and it's shot so subtly and well. Silver spies the lead performer lady performing oral sex in the club. She reels in horror, so it's more of that loss of innocence and like what is it that people are doing, and the director talks about that's what it's really like I said, about for these girls growing up in this Polish nightclub. You're seeing people drinking, there's people having sex in bathrooms, like the stories that are unfolding before you at very early ages can be wildly confusing and upsetting. She describes that as part of the passage. It's where they have their first cigarettes and things of that nature as well. Gold then kills a man in a car, drags her full mermaid body down the bank, so we get to see her moving that like 90-pound tail. And to have the actor really do that motion it looks natural. It's very impressive. So I don't know how much training you go through with your tails and things so that you're not just like a person that's like hopping, in front of people.
The mermaid crawl, we call that the mermaid crawl.
Okay, yeah.
And I do that move a lot, although I'm not moving my lower half. Actually, I am now that I think about it when I'm in shallow water. And I'm moving my body from deeper water to shallow water, particularly natural bodies of water.
Yeah.
There is sort of an eel-like movement, which is actually more accurate to how a human upper body would function. In the tail, it's all upper body strength. So the one thing about mermaiding, for those that are interested, you build extraordinary core strength.
Yeah.
And I would say the training that's involved is just building strength. That's a strength. You have to be able to push you're literally pulling your entire weight of your body plus the tail with just your arms, depending on where you are. And that can be, you will be sore.
Yeah.
Several days after that. So I would imagine that these, the women that did this movie had a lot of nice warm body soaks they probably had to do after each filming, because it takes a lot of strength. And their tails in particular were what it reminded me of was very eel-like. Not so much fish, but more like an eel. And that body movement also can be taxing, but also just very sort of, it's an interesting image, visualization to sort of see that movement as well.
Yeah. Silver then offers herself to the hunk, and he tells her she will always be an animal to him. She even says, "Do you want me to be a human?" After he has turned her down, and she plucks a scale from her tail and offers it to him. This scene, for me, was, it's very symbolic, I think, of a lot of things, and I just felt genuinely sad.
I have so much to say, I guess. I think, again, it's sort of this story of not being accepted for who you are and this deep desire for connection, love, and acceptance, and the lengths that some of us are willing to go to have that happen, right? And for me, loss of innocence is not about coming into sexuality, and I think that where I struggle too is when we articulate these stories as a loss of innocence, we're preserving sort of that patriarchal version of womanhood, and where when men come into sexuality, young boys, we don't call it a loss of innocence, we call it coming into manhood.
Right.
So I think where loss of innocence occurs is when there's loss of agency.
And I mean it as a childhood. I don't mean a sexual.
Right, but even in young, that's the whole point though, right? It's like it's assumed that young girls aren't pursuing these dreams or these desires, right? And that somehow, if they're exposed to it, they're like, they're
not even supposed to have the thought unless a guy's like, we're gonna have sex. It's not like, oh, a girl would never have a want or a need like that's not involving a man.
Well, and I think that's where the metaphor of this scene comes in, right? Is that she's initiating a relationship or connection, or she's initiating interest and then rejected, right? And for me, symbolically, I think that's an interesting sort of piece of it. And I'm not saying that there isn't loss of innocence. I think where we see that is in the exploitation and in the violence and in the loss of voice and consent, right? And there's that piece of that voice, which we haven't gotten to yet, but losing that. And yeah, it is sad, right? Because at this moment, what she decides is, this is what I want. Right. And that other piece of her, because I think metaphorically, the sister is really a part of her. And so that's the part, this other reasoning that's happening. Like, do you really want to do this? Do you really want to give up this world and this connection of who you are in order to, achieve this object?
She sings to him, and then we get this sort of Trainspotting-esque transition where he goes into the tub and they're like deep underwater, just floating around. She entrances him, which seems like a perfect time to ask you about the swim tank. So how deep is the tank? Did you design it? And how do you have a heating element, or do you have to put like warm water into the tank?
Okay.
Like, how do you do it all?
So the tank was not built from scratch by me. It's 10 years old. It was, but it was handmade. It was built by some folks on the Oregon coast. It was a dunk tank.
Got it. That makes sense.
And it came with this whole rigged structure and system, and the glass was the acrylic was far too thin. There was leaks, and so the tank has been refurbished and repurposed.
Okay.
And it is 5 feet by 5 feet, so it's about 5 feet of water, although I don't typically fill it to the rim because it'll spill. Once I'm in it, it'll be
Sure.
about 5 feet. So it's 5 feet cubed, basically. And we have a heating element. I have been in my tank without heat.
Yeah.
When I first debuted the tank, we had not had an opportunity to heat the water yet, and it was very, very cold. And I could only be in it actually for about an hour at a time. And even then, that was probably too much. People don't realize that mermaiding is not all, it looks amazing, and it's, and it sort of creates that awe factor, but there is a lot of physical taxing on the body with mermaiding in a variety of ways. And one of which is the water is difficult for your sinuses, your head, your ears, and then let alone the temperature. And so, but yes, the water temp was too cold. Now it has a heating element. I actually, each day that it sits with the heating element on, it goes up several degrees. So when I released it, it was at OMSI, actually. That was the most recent event. And it was a 2-day event. And so it actually had 3 full days of being heated. So by the 3rd day, the water was actually up to 98 degrees.
Whoa.
Which might actually be a little too hot for what I think I would prefer because of my eyes. Because my eyes are open underwater and I'm interacting with the public. So it's a magical formula. I'm still trying to work out about the alchemy of being in that environment. So it's heated, thank goodness.
Yeah.
Because I wouldn't really be able to do it in the Northwest without that component.
Yeah, you'd have to have like a wetsuit on.
Yeah.
You also do parties and events.
I do. I don't do parties that often. I mostly events.
Okay.
There's the occasional party I will get asked to do, and I do like doing them, and they can be fun. But usually I'm doing community events.
Got it. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And that's on the website.
Yes.
So at unathemermaid.com. Gold then reemerges, and Silver sees blood on her mouth and thinks that she's been up to something bad, which she has. Next, the sisters perform a wicked electro number in the club. It's one of the great musical compositions. All of the music in this film is written by the two that the film is about, the two girls that grew up in the club. They actually do all the music, and you can see them performing a number of the numbers, which is pretty fantastic. It's full-on hedonism in the club now. You get the feeling there's debauchery and excess and vices, and we're kind of seeing the darker side of the nightclub scene. Gold is asked to be in a band by a man creature, and he tells her that if the sister falls in love with a human, she will turn into sea foam. I'm guessing this is from the Hans Christian Andersen one?
Yeah.
Okay, and he is something from the sea, but I don't know what he is. He had horns at one point.
Yeah, I think he is a type of merman or mer being, definitely. Which I think in the film, too, they're rather surprised that they discover him.
Yeah.
That he's been living on land. So I think in that moment, you get this impression that these two worlds have been interacting with each other for probably a while. Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah.
Next, a lady shows up and says she's going to blackmail Gold because she knows that she did something bad. So she sings a song and sort of puts the lady under her spell, and then they have sex. Then we have this image of the mermaids breastfeeding on the main female performer, the lady that we saw in the very beginning of the film. It's a very stark image that I'm not sure exactly why it's in the film. What it's saying, I'm not sure.
That was a really interesting part of the film, and I don't know if I'm remembering this correctly because it's been a little while since I've seen it, but I also feel like shortly before that scene, there may have been some illicit drug use that was going on in addition to the siren song, and I almost get this impression, I don't know, like it's an expression of extreme, like sort of societal taboo. But then I also feel like there's definitely some symbolic things happening there.
Yeah.
Right?
And the breastfeeding scene, I'm just like, I'm with you on most of the symbolism.
I was a little lost.
I'm a little confused.
Yeah.
Then there's a weird sort of lamp dance by the drummer guy. The TV says that there's body parts found on the beach. So that's obviously from one of the mermaids. Silver slaps Gold. They have a little fight, if you will. And then the drummer guy hits them both in the face and then dumps them in the river. I was like, what is happening at this point? Then we see a terrible scene of domestic abuse unfolds in the home between the drummer guy, the hunk, the lady. The family's in total turmoil. And then the girls return to the club, and one of them bites the thumb off of the man.
Yes.
Which I think you were talking about is from, kind of goes back to the beginning of the film.
Yeah, I think that there's a reclaiming of power.
Yeah.
So after they're punched, right, they're not just punched, they're rolled into a carpet.
Yes.
Both of them.
Dumped in
rolled
the
into a carpet, dumped into the water. It's assumed that they're dead. And there is this sort of resurrection, right, that happens.
Yeah.
And then a reclaiming of power, right? And then they walk onto the land, and then they're like, okay, we're going to redefine this relationship a bit.
That's true.
Then I feel like what they're doing in that moment, too, like I think with the biting of the finger, like, okay, it was out of anger, but it was also almost kind of like a repositioning of power. Like, let me remind you of what we're capable of.
Yeah.
Sort of like in all honesty, like this is the weird part of it, right? We actually know what their ability is.
Yes.
Right. We know that they are capable of destroying and eating. I mean, there is this monster element, right? And so they're actually tolerating quite a lot of harm, and in a way it almost doesn't really make sense, because you're like, they don't have to tolerate that. Actually, they have the power completely within them to annihilate that whole situation, but they choose not to. And
so interesting.
And the lashing out, which is interesting, because out of all the ways they could have lashed out, they didn't kill the guy, right? They removed one finger. In a very vicious way, but they remove one finger. And I think there's something to be said about that as well. There's a symbology there, because there was a restraint, right? I mean, there was obviously...
They would just claw his throat out or something.
Right. And they don't.
No.
Why? Right? Like,
that's a great point.
Yeah.
I never even thought about that.
Yeah.
Then Gold goes to the punk show. She loves the chaos and screams her way through a performance. Stark contrast to her beautiful singing previously. There's a photo shoot where the sisters telepathically discuss that Silver wants to remove her tail, and Gold says that if she does, she will lose her voice. Is this also something that's from the Hans Christian Andersen thing, the idea that you would lose your voice with the tail? Or is this something maybe new that they were coming up with? Or
I don't think...
Oh, wait. In The Little Mermaid, when she has legs, because she can't talk, right?
Yeah, that's The Little Mermaid with the voice.
Okay.
I don't think in Hans Christian Andersen, she has 3 days, I think it is, to convince this prince to love her, and then if he doesn't, she has to kill him. But there's no voice involved. She will just simply die. She'll die. She'll turn to sea foam if she doesn't complete the task.
Okay.
I think the voice element came from Disney.
That's Disney.
Yeah.
Okay. So she and the hunk pay a dirty doctor to swap legs for the fishtail. We get a horrific aerial shot of a halved body on a Gertie, and her mermaid body is on the other.
Yeah. It's this weird back alley.
It's so crazy.
Surgery, Frankenstein doctor sort of experience where, it's like, we're going to remove this and we're going to do a leg transplant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A whole lower half of the body transplant. Right. It's
I was a little... because of the sciencey side of me,
Sure.
I got a little hung up on the biological details of that scene, and I struggled a little bit. I'm not gonna lie, because I was like, that would not work. But
but it's also a murderous mermaid musical movie.
I know, exactly.
Yeah.
I had to remind myself of that.
I know. I saw Aquaman.
Yes.
And whatever happens, and I think I've mentioned on the podcast, but whatever happens in the film, with writing sharks or whatever it is, the only thing I couldn't get over with the entirety of the film is that Jason Momoa swims in denim. Just the whole time I was just like, that would be so uncomfortable. And he's just like doing it over and over. I'm like, no, he would have to, put lycra, something. I don't know.
And drag.
Yeah.
It's not a speed.
Oh, it's awful.
Fabric.
Yeah, he's got a wallet chain and swims with that. It's just madness. This is the scene where the tail isn't hideous, and she doesn't mention it in the commentary or anything, but the tail actually looks somewhat pretty as they're removing it, which is very strange. Silver then has legs. She has sex with the hunk, which is very disturbing. There's blood all over him, which could be symbolism in the sequence. Since she's no longer a mermaid, she's kicked out of the performance group. He falls for another girl, so she has no voice and no tail. Everything is just falling apart at this part of the film. There's a wedding for them, and she's told to eat him by dawn or she will expire. At the party, 2 women we see performing. They're the sisters that we've been watching in the film. And Gold watches her sister on crutches and says, eat him, but Silver won't. She hugs him and becomes sea foam. Gold then kills him much to my delight at this point in the film, and she returns to the sea alone. But you aren't alone. You have sort of created or found a community of people. I see a lot of times on Instagram many different faces at different events and things. What is the process for finding people? And do people just go up to you and find you and say, I would like to be a mer person? I would like to do an event? Or because people get, I mean, anyone listening should go to the Instagram if you haven't already. Is people do elaborate just makeup and presentation. It's a lot more than someone just like putting on a tail.
Correct.
You know. So how do people find you for that?
Well, I think a lot of my personal community has been literally people who have walked up to me who have stated, I want to do this.
Yeah.
And I help give them information on how they can, whether they do it independently or if they want to do it with us. There's actually entire networks online made up of international mermaid communities. Whoa. Where mermaids can enter in and learn about the field, whether, like I said, whether you're doing it for hobby or professionally. And, you know, some mermaids, some of the most world famous mermaids, this is a full on career. They're making their living this way. Some of them are activists. They're swimming in the deepest part of the ocean as free divers. I mean, so we have mermaids that are, you know, sort of, I don't know, I don't want to call it kitschy, but we have the Wiki Watchy mermaids of Florida. They're 50-year performance gig that's been going on there. It's very, you know, its own thing for sure. And has
very old school.
Very old school. Kind of has a vintage sort of feel to it with how their performances are. And there's definitely athleticism that goes in that. But then you've got some of these merfolk that are like, you know, Hannah the Mermaid is a really great example, and Melissa the Mermaid. These are, if you just Google those names, for example, you're going to see them swimming with sharks and whale sharks, free diving under the ocean.
With a tail?
With a tail, and often even with signs, like with messages about the ocean. Maybe. And there's also underwater modeling, where some mermaids, you know, that's predominantly what they're doing. They're doing modeling work. It's all, so there's a spectrum of the professional mermaid field, and you know, everything from live tank performances to land, what we call land gigs or dry gigs, where you're not in water but you're entertaining. And when we do those gigs, you know, we might be doing storytelling. We're entertaining children. But a lot of mermaiding is not entertaining children. It's actually entertaining adults, and people, I think, don't always realize that. I do a little bit of both. We do both. It's actually important to me to entertain with adults because it's about sparking the imagination in adults. It's a really big part of my personal mission in the work that I do is reminding adults to play and to allow themselves to not feel like a fish out of water when they're doing that.
Yeah, so. I have been massively fascinated in the more serious aspects of what you're talking about, but I think that's really important to remember too, that there can be a fun element to the mermaiding as well. It doesn't have to be all of these. I just naturally dive straight into the, but what does it mean personally for it? And it's like, it could be just an outlet of pure joy and creating wonder for people.
And the tail is a prosthetic. So if you are utilizing actual water going tails, you know, I'm going to say, if you haven't swam with one, you don't know what you're missing, and you probably wouldn't want to go back. Like, I honestly don't know why so many mermaids want to have legs because swimming with the tail is quite fantastic, and doing it in natural bodies of water, actually alone, or not necessarily doing it for entertainment purposes, but for recreational purposes. There's nothing like being outdoors in nature in some of the most beautiful settings, which is often what some of my mermaid community, what we will do is we will go and seek out beautiful settings and go swim in those places for no other purpose than to simply be with each other and experience that. That's pretty fantastic.
Wow. And I can't imagine just being a hiker that stumbles across a group of mer people.
Yeah, we've had some interesting
That's got to
encounters.
be amazing. I mean, what a treat. Like, you know.
For them, we actually do it. We try to get away sometimes from humans as much as possible, and it's harder and harder to do.
Oh, I bet. And that is the end of the film. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share on the lure?
Only that, again, I feel like there's this repeated message about the great price you pay for sacrificing who you are. Yeah. You know, I think that this tale it's a tragedy, right? Is that sure. There's a great price. There was a price of personal voice, you know, so voice symbolizes, you know, your literal voice, but also your own opinions, your thoughts, your self-identity, your your agency.
Yes.
You lose relationships, right? The person that was really the closest to her being her sister,
Yeah.
right? She lost that, and then her life at the end
Right.
as well. And so just sort of a reminder that it's not worth it.
Right. No, exactly. Are there, well, I don't usually ask this question, but being that you know so much about mermaids, are there any films that you would recommend that do deal with mermaids?
Oh gosh. I mean, I have fun watching a lot of the mermaid films, but I'll be honest, I haven't seen one yet that has called to me as like, wow.
Yeah.
I mean, I've loved elements of different. I mean, Splash, of course, is
course.
fun and amazing,
Yeah.
and it's a fun love story. I will say this. Classically speaking, I do love Mr. Peabody and the Mermaid.
Okay.
If you haven't seen that. Also, as far as empowerment,
Is
honestly,
that Don Knotts?
No,
Okay.
that is
just
in
sounds
Mr. Limpet. I
Oh,
want to
okay.
feel like that might be Mr.
Yeah, yeah,
Limpet.
yeah.
And the other classic, I want to say this is like 1950s, 1960s, is Miranda.
Miranda.
And that's probably my most favorite of the mermaid films. It's black and white. It is female empowerment to the T.
Okay, well maybe you'll come back and talk about Miranda.
It's and there's a sequel to that as well. There's two of them, and they're fantastic. And you should. Yes, I love it. It's actually my favorite, and it's strangely, considering the era in which that film was made,
Yeah.
it's probably one of the more progressive
That's fascinating.
messages for mermaids, actually,
Yeah.
than even modern time. I feel, and it's a comedy. Also, it's hilarious, and it's done really well.
Okay, Miranda.
Miranda.
I will check that out for sure. Are there any common misconceptions about mermaids?
You mean mythologically or in the professional?
Professional.
Misconceptions. I don't think there are misconceptions, more so than we get interesting questions. I think people approach mermaids with a very open mind and very inquisitive mind. And I think as professional mermaids, we're just really used to getting inappropriate questions. And I think the hardest part sometimes of being a mermaid is preserving the illusion when we're working with children. So, adults always wanting to ask technical, logistical questions in front of the kids. Where did you get your tail? Where did you make your tail? Are you Ariel? Do you know Ariel? Right? These things. And as far as like misconceptions, every mer person that I know has created their own, what we call a mersana, and their backstory. And so each mermaid will have different views and a lens of what mermaids are, how they interact with the world. And so it's just very different depending on the person. But I would say this, mermaids don't typically sing and drown sailors to their death. That's
good.
Typically the job of a siren.
Great. I'm glad we could clear that up. What is a good day like for you in professional mermaid?
So I've thought about this a lot, and I will share part of my personal journey, which is one of the reasons why the tank was so important to me. Is because I love working with the Cove, which is my traveling cove. It's the community of MERS where we're all doing it together.
Fantasy Cove.
Yes, and we have fun, right? And at any given moment, there might be anywhere between 8 to even 14 merfolk at one time together. And that's fantastic, but something is lost in that group dynamic that I didn't realize was lost actually until, over the last several years. And there is something to be said for interacting one-on-one with people. And the tank is a very interesting experience. One, you actually can't see anybody when you're behind the glass. I know that it gives the illusion that I can actually see people. I'm giving away a secret here, but mermaids actually can't see out the glass.
Oh.
Yeah, and the hearing is limited. I can hear, and I can see,
So
but
your eyes are open, but
my
you
eyes
can't
are
see people.
the glass and the water create a warping effect, and it's completely blurred.
Wow.
I see shapes, and if a person approaches right up to the glass, I can see them, but I cannot see them. I cannot make out fine details. If they're speaking, I can only hear them if they're speaking directly, literally up against the glass.
Yeah.
So this is a very interesting experience to be entertaining. And being completely right on this sort of visual stage, if you will, underwater, and not actually being able to see or hear anything coming back at you. And there's something very peaceful about that. And it's magical for, I think, both the person on the other side of the glass, because it creates this mystery for them, and like sort of it really is another world. You're in this water, we're separated by glass. And I think that it creates that sense of mystery, which creates that awe and wonder.
Yeah.
But for the mermaid perspective, because we can have negative encounters with humans. We've had them both with, young children who have been violent and disrespectful, actually.
Oh, jeez.
And sometimes adults who are just flat out rude or just not appropriate
Yeah.
for whatever reason. And so what's nice about the glass is that it's a barrier in some regard, but it's also a sanctuary. Like, I mean, I grew up in the ocean, and there's something very tranquil and amazing being underwater.
Yes.
And so for me, getting that one-on-one experience where there's no other distractions. I'm not having to manage the relationships or dynamics of all the people, because, I'm happy to run a volunteer space, but it's work, and
Yes.
and sometimes I get focused on the operation of the space, and I lose my own personal. I almost forget why I'm doing what I'm doing. Like,
Yeah.
I become wrapped up in the business element of it,
the
of
manager
like the
of it all.
managing it,
Yeah.
and I've lost the magic. And
Yeah.
so the tank for me is sort of my own resurrection after being thrown into the sea and coming back out, and reclaiming my power, and sort of reminding myself, like, you're a mermaid, and this is why you were doing it.
Right.
And so there's that piece for me.
That's awesome. And I don't want to ask, but it's the next question always. What's a bad day like for Una the
Bad
Mermaid?
day. A bad day is, it doesn't happen that often, but I'll be in an event or a community where we're just going to say, I don't mean to be derogatory, but I'm going to use a Harry Potter reference. We call this encounters with muggles.
Okay.
And in Harry Potter series, right, muggles or no mages are known as non-magical people. And what I mean by that is people who have lost their sense of imagination.
Yes.
And that's, for me, that is where magic comes from. It comes from that place of imagination.
Oh, for sure.
And we will encounter children at their, I think one of the youngest I encountered was maybe 4, who literally was not allowed by their parents to believe in anything. And the parents were very literal about everything. They didn't feel the benefit of the child being allowed to believe in anything make-believe, or to even play make-believe.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing more and more of this, actually,
No.
where children are like, you're not a real mermaid. They're 4 or 5.
Yeah.
I can see your legs. I know you're not real. My parents say that you're not real. And I teach parenting in a correctional facility. And so, as in my background is in psychology. So I have, it's not just I want people to believe because I'm a mermaid and it's a more engaging encounter when people believe, but also from a science perspective and a psychology perspective, it's really damaging for children to be robbed of their imagination.
Yeah, yes.
And even as adults, the part of our brains that are able to tackle large world problems like, I don't know, climate change,
Yeah.
and overpopulation and disease and these things where we need those skills to imagine solutions. Adults don't realize that same part of the brain that creates imagination for joy, fun, and play is the same part of the brain that allows you to imagine solutions to problems. And so for me, it is very much a task to help inspire people to not be afraid to play and imagine, and that it's okay to entertain the idea for a moment that mermaids might be real. And so a bad day is when I am in a space or an environment that for whatever reason I'm being inundated with people who don't believe. But sometimes it doesn't even have to be like a bunch of people. Sometimes it feels heartbreaking when I even meet just that one child.
Yeah.
For whatever reason. But usually after I engage with them for a few minutes, I find, I use my psychology background to kind of reel them into play. And,
Right.
and usually I'll just tell them and I'll say, well, don't you want to play? And then they're like, oh,
I do want
I
to play.
do want to play. And all of sort of this like very practical linear thinking of their parents is sort of put on pause, and they go back to being a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what's really significant too, is just sort of allowing children to preserve the child, if we want to talk about innocence, not robbing children of their innocence by robbing them of their imagination. So
That's super important.
yeah.
Well, that brings us to the last question, and it's my favorite question. Una the Mermaid, what are your dreams like?
What are my dreams like?
Yeah.
What can you clarify that?
Like when you go to sleep, what does your brain do?
What does my brain do?
Do you have stress dreams,
Oh, wow.
fantastical mer dreams?
Wow. Well, I think with any share of human beings, I have had my share of nightmares and I've had my share of whimsical dreams. But I'll say this, I live my dreams.
Oh,
I spend very little time in that place because I'm out doing it.
that's awesome. Wow. And that's where we'll end it. I cannot thank you enough for coming. It's been a real pleasure. People can't tell from the recording, but I've been nodding along to pretty much everything that you've said. I think what you do is incredibly important. And thank you for watching The Lure and for coming in to record today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.